one of our strongest predictors of these kids ending up violent is the reason why you're transferred. And obviously, right off the bat, you look at, nearly 3/4 have been expelled. What we do in the Canadian context is we put them in specialized schools, they're called alternate schools, and there's positive and negative effects of that schooling. The positive is the teacher to student ratio is low, so they get the personalized attention they don't get when the class sizes, for example, in British Columbia, can be 30, 35, and teachers teach to the median student, not the high-end student or the struggling student. They go for the average. The negative part of the alternative schools is its labeling. And you're taking students out of the broader social context that they have to go back into. So you can put them in the alternate schools, but one way or another they have to come back in. And as you know, the alternate schools are filled with kids just like you. So you're concerned with informal group dynamics. And there's, again, I mentioned the moving, change homes, the friendship patterns, and then look at this figure. Again, nearly 1/5. So, again, when we're talking to school officials, advising, we talk to them about you have to devise a different strategy than changing the youth's complete social context. The damage could be even worse. So they have to come up with some way, and there are ways of dealing with this. Now, the other concern we have is, as I mentioned, we're very much concerned with what are the impacts of custody. There's two schools of thought here. One school of thought is for a certain profile of kids, sometimes custody can be a very safe place, and one of the few places where they get to eat properly, be safe, and have some experience of positive mentoring and parenting even. The Canadian custody centers, particularly in British Columbia, again, in my role as oversight, in my oversight role, I could vouch they were rarely will you ever see a staff member even raise a voice against the youth. If you touch a kid, you will lose your job, only in self-defense. So there are elaborate protocols and training that you cannot be aggressive, you cannot be in any way discriminatory, or you will lose your job. So it's very, very strict. We have also an ombudsperson that a youth can just grab the phone, call. You also have, in Canada, all these youth have automatic right to defense counsel. Automatic. So you just, if something happens, you can call your defense counsel and say, this happened to me. So when we look at, one of my doctoral students is just finishing a thesis about sort of what are the deprivation effects versus importation effects on aggression and violence, and there's very, very little institutional effect in the BC context. They're designed to be progressive, and so the more positive behaviors, the quicker you move into an open setting. But you can see that if we come down almost always, these patterns have trouble sleeping. Again, there becomes a question of, is it alcohol, drug related? Coming down from this difficult, it is difficult to get there. Obviously, there is contraband that comes into the custody centers, but extremely hard. So if that's what you're used to, self-medicating, difficult to get that. And then as you come down. But I was this is where we did our focus. So there is a substantial number, and this is probably one of the most encouraging, right down here. When we asked the youth about their self-identity, 61% thought of my life has been a failure, 61%. I like to flip it too. I like to say that means that 39% didn't. So we don't want to look at all these kids stereotypically. We need to identify types. It's something we haven't really done in our research. I'm a firm believer in Jerome Keegan's admonition. to get away from dimensional analysis and stay with the old types, because dimensional analysis doesn't make the distinctions that you need for treatment purposes, clinical purposes. There is that group that has the positive identity. Well, their treatment structure is vastly different from the 60% that have a negative self label. There's different treatment strategies, there just are. So that's important there. We found this hugely encouraging, because these are the kids telling us what worked. And again, we were very, 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 very surprised and happy with it. Again, when we looked at school, very high for us. Even this one, that we were to say that they found it enjoyable, and we explored that, and what the answers they gave were the ratio that they felt that the teacher had time for them and wasn't impatient, and that they weren't labeled by other students. They didn't feel stupid in larger classes because you can't answer. In this context, you're in a situation where the teacher can focus on you. And these types of, again, they're low cost, but sometimes this is their first experience. Growing up Italian, I would argue in retrospect that maybe one of the highlights was watching my mother cook and me eating it. So, but even here too, I think this is incredibly important. Because I'm not talking about anything. I'm just talking about positive modeling. So you can't take away from the notion of positive modeling. I think what religion does is give them some sense that there's somebody caring, that there's something in it, in that. So I often, and within the Aboriginal community, what we find is the elders and spiritual leaders are very, very reassuring for Aboriginal. So when we talk to our Aboriginal students and our Aboriginal elder in our major custody center, he has a calming effect on everybody, including our researchers. He's just a really, this one particular individual, just that earth-based spiritualism almost as a sweetness, which is non-denominational. It's just talking about putting yourself at peace with the nature, which in British Columbia is quite dramatic to see in the mountains. So that's extremely important there. And then the fitness. When you look at certain types or profiles, when you're dealing with ADHD, when you're dealing with hyperactivity, particularly among boys, sports programs work. They're structured and they work. And I remember when I do my workshops, it doesn't matter who I do them for, whether it's judges or teachers or I always get, when I do these types of presentations, they'll come up to me and the judge will say, I've got a 15-year-old. What do I do? I'll say, you put him in hockey, basketball, football, and you run his butt. Because that's what I do with my boys. I had them in every sport. They were huge. And I lost control over them physically by about 13. But I ran them through every sport. And there's something to it. You deal with temperament. Your children vary by temperament. If their temperaments are high reactive and they're super sensitive, you got to adjust the intervention that you do as a parent to the fact that if you put a kid that's high reactive and hypersensitive in a highly tense situation, you're setting him up or her for failure. So it's the matching treatment issues. For example, while that works well for certain boys and girls who are highly aggressive, for girls, often dealing with certain trauma issues who are high reactive girls, that means that they're hypersensitive to their environments, PET programs work extremely well. And we have one program in Canada that uses horses. And one of the conferences I was presenting, we were all presenting our research, the one that had a video, and in this video, there was this big tough kid who had a history of a lot of violence. You could see him, he walks up to the horse and they picked the horse who knew how to deal with other aggressive horses, and this horse just gently backed this kid up because the kid's standing there, and meanwhile he gives them a nudge, and the kid, so he had him against the fence. He wasn't threatening him, he just backed him up, and gradually you could see the kid saying, it drained out of him, and then he reached up and touched the kid, and then the horse started responding. For the girl, they gave the girl a very sort of gentle horse that actually was shy and backed away. So it's fascinating to see they're actually doing, you know, these types of evaluation studies, and it works. Yeah. So I knew I was going to run over, but and again, this I think is also fairly important. We don't show a lot of success with with general impact of counseling. But where we do, where there is success, particularly with cognitive behavioral programs, you know, but it depends on the rapport, individual rapport. So the matching of clinicians and psychologists to these types of kids works extremely well. So you can't bring someone who isn't trained to work with these kids in, but if they come in, so we look at that as highly successful. We have a specialized unit to deal with these kids in custody. So that, I know them all, I work with them. We do research together. They're all really sensitized to these types of profiles, and they do extremely well with these kids. So I came away from this saying, at least in our context, that's very hopeful. For the first time in history, I think we've got a really excellent understanding of the developmental profiles. And for each developmental profile, if it's pregnancy, pre-pregnancy, pregnancy, birth trauma, all the way up to 18, 19 years old. The work, for example, of Samson and Lobb showing that you can have a turning point at 18, you can have a turning point at 30, you can have a turning point at 40. So the idea that you give up, that there's this one pathway to hell, it just doesn't hold. Except for a tiny, tiny, maybe 1% or 2% that we've identified as, you can either call them primary psychopaths or full psychopaths, or I don't want to ever deny that there isn't that tiny percentage. We've interviewed them, they're there, they're for real. They've killed their entire families and no remorse, zero. So I don't want to pretend like that doesn't exist, but 99% I would argue there's tremendous hope at every developmental stage. Thank you.